During the civil rights struggle of the mid-20th century, many men stood out, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Medger Evers, and Malcolm X. Famed author Alex Haley, who wrote Roots, the Saga of an American Family, befriended Malcolm X and co-authored his autobiography. Malcolm X was perhaps the most controversial figure of the civil rights movement. People saw him as radical, irreverent, violent, and dangerous. The U.S. government felt the same way about him. But Malcolm was a creature of conformity, and his message changed, as did his audience, to the point that even leading white leaders began to change their opinion of him. In 1992, director Spike Lee released the acclaimed movie Malcolm X, which received Oscar nominations for Best Actor for Denzel Washington and Best Costume Design. Malcolm X has become a legend and a martyr since his death. But why? Who was Malcolm X? How and why did he become a civil rights icon and pariah? How was he perceived by blacks and whites alike? Why did the federal government take an interest in him? How and why did he make so many enemies? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. His father, the Reverend Earl Little, was a Baptist minister and had been an active supporter of black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey. His mother, Louise, was Earl's second marriage, and he was the national recording secretary for the Marcus Garvey movement, which commanded millions of followers in the 1920s and 30s. The family moved to Lansing, Michigan when Malcolm was an infant, where he grew up. Malcolm was an extremely intelligent boy and excelled in school, but after one of his 8th grade teachers told him that he should become a carpenter instead of a lawyer, he lost interest and soon ended his formal education. Earl Little, as a Baptist minister, was also the chapter president of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, who appealed to President Hoover that Marcus Garvey was wrongfully arrested. Earl Little was very active in civil rights for blacks, and his efforts for Garvey, as well as his efforts for civil rights in general, saw him and the family receive death threats from the white supremacist organization, the Black Legion, who had a similar platform and ideology as the Ku Klux Klan, but sometimes they were even more violent, forcing the family to relocate twice before Malcolm's 4th birthday. In 1929, their Lansing, Michigan home was burnt to the ground, and arson was proven, although there were no arrests. 3 years later, in 1929, when Malcolm was 6 years old, his father's body was found lying across the tracks after he was hit by a streetcar. And it was widely believed that he was murdered by Black Legion. The police ruled both incidents as accidents, but the Littles were certain that members of the Black Legion were responsible. Without their father's income, the family fell into extreme poverty, and Louise resorted to cooking dandelion greens from the street to feed her children. Louise Little suffered emotional breakdowns and was eventually committed to a mental institution in 1939. Her children were divided up between foster homes and relatives. Young Malcolm found himself in trouble with the law as a teenager and was incarcerated in the Michigan State Detention Home for Juvenile Offenders in Mason, Michigan. After his release, Malcolm moved to the Roxbury section of Boston to live with his older half-sister, Ella, where he became involved in petty crimes. He was known on the street as Detroit Red for the reddish tinge in his hair, and he joined a gang of thieves in Roxbury and also in New York City, where he became a street hustler, drug dealer, and then a gang leader in Harlem. Due to the intense scrutiny of their gang's actions in New York, Malcolm and his friend Malcolm Shorty Jarvis moved back to Boston, where they were arrested and convicted on burglary charges in 1946. Malcolm Little was sentenced to 10 years in prison but was paroled after serving 7 years. While incarcerated, he used the time to further his education and was an avid reader. His brother Reginald became a member of the Nation of Islam in Detroit and was later incarcerated with Malcolm in the Norfolk Prison Colony in Massachusetts in 1948. Reginald and Malcolm discussed his recent conversion to the Muslim religion and his membership in the Nation of Islam, which Malcolm found interesting. Malcolm converted and quit smoking and gambling and refused to eat pork in keeping with the nation's dietary restrictions. He also swore to go straight and abandon criminal activities and remain celibate until he married. From his direct biography, quote, "Intrigued, Malcolm began to study the teachings of NOI leader Elijah Muhammad. Muhammad taught that white society actively worked to keep African Americans from empowering themselves and achieving political, economic, and social success. He was interested in the Nation of Islam's desire for a state of their own, separate from one inhabited by white people. This was understandable given the Little family's experience with white supremacists. Upon being paroled in 1952, Malcolm joined the Nation of Islam, taking the new surname X, since he considered Little to be a slave name and chose the X to signify his lost tribal name. He met Elijah Muhammad in Chicago in 1952, and Malcolm was appointed as a minister and the chief national spokesman by the NOI, and he was also given the responsibility of establishing temples for the Nation of Islam in New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, Harlem in New York, Boston, and in several cities in the South. Muhammad was very radical in his beliefs, which at first appealed to Malcolm and most of the young black men who had suffered racial oppression, and answered Muhammad's call to destroy the white blue-eyed devils, among other radical beliefs. But Malcolm was somewhat different than most of the Nation of Islam members, as he was highly intelligent and articulate. He knew history, philosophy, and religion, and he could read people. He astutely utilized newspaper columns as well as radio and television to communicate the Nation of Islam's message across the United States. His charisma, drive, and conviction attracted an astounding number of new members. Malcolm was largely credited with increasing the membership in the Nation of Islam from 500 in 1952 to 30,000 in 1963, and nationwide membership numbered around 500,000 by 1965. His national reputation was colorful and controversial and grew rapidly, and the media, both black and white, wanted to hear his story and message. He also founded the nation's newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, which he printed in the basement of his home. He also required every male member of the Nation of Islam to sell a certain number of newspapers on the street as a recruiting and fundraising technique. Malcolm was effective at spreading the Nation of Islam's racial doctrines on the inherent evil of whites and the natural superiority of blacks. Elijah Muhammad also took notice, and he was the teacher and mentor of not only Malcolm X, but also Louis Farrakhan, Muhammad Ali, and his own son, Warith Deen Muhammad. Malcolm was featured in a week-long television special with Mike Wallace, later of 60 Minutes fame, in 1959 called The Hate That Hate Produced, which discussed the philosophy, ambitions, and the fundamentals of the Nation of Islam and tracked Malcolm's emergence as one of his most important leaders. Following this show, Malcolm was faced with the uncomfortable reality that his fame had eclipsed that of his mentor, Elijah Muhammad, who did have a fragile ego. Racial tensions in the country increased exponentially during the early 1960s, and the Nation of Islam had become of great interest to the FBI, and Malcolm X was a special target of interest under the orders of Director J. Edgar Hoover, who spied on everyone involved. As membership in the Nation of Islam continued to grow, FBI agents infiltrated the organization, and one was even positioned to be one of Malcolm's bodyguards. They secretly placed bugs, wiretaps, cameras, and other surveillance equipment to monitor the group's activities, just as they did with Martin Luther King. This was part of the early counterintelligence operations, better known as COINTELPRO. See our video on J. Edgar Hoover on this and other facts related to the FBI under Hoover. The FBI took interest in Malcolm after he preached on the streets of Harlem and spoke at major universities such as Harvard University and the University of Oxford in England. His keen intellect, incisive wit, and ardent radicalism made him a formidable critic of American society. He also criticized the mainstream civil rights movement, challenging Martin Luther King Jr.'s central notions of integration and nonviolence. Malcolm argued that more was at stake than the civil right to sit in a restaurant or even to vote. The most important issues were black identity, integrity, and independence. Malcolm was apparently living what he preached, and his sincerity in his faith was a major attraction which brought most of the new members. Malcolm had strictly adhered to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, which included remaining celibate until his marriage to Betty Shabazz in 1958. However, in 1963, he learned that the Nation of Islam leader, Elijah Muhammad, the man he saw almost as a surrogate father figure, despite being married, was secretly having relations with as many as 6 women in the Nation of Islam, which produced illegitimate children, most of these women working within the organization proper, and a couple were his secretaries. Elijah Muhammad wanted Malcolm's help, along with Louis Farrakhan, to help cover up the affairs and the subsequent children. Malcolm was deeply hurt by the deception of Muhammad, whom he had considered a living prophet. Farrakhan was compliant and agreed to help. Malcolm also felt guilty about the masses he had led to join the Nation of Islam, which he now felt was a fraudulent organization built on too many lies to ignore. Malcolm refused to help Muhammad, considering him a false prophet, and even denounced Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. Again, from his biography, shortly after his shocking discovery, Malcolm received criticism for a comment he made regarding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, saying that he, Kennedy, never foresaw that the chickens would come home to roost so soon. After that statement, Elijah Muhammad silenced Malcolm for 90 days. Malcolm, however, suspected he was silenced for another reason. In March 1964, Malcolm terminated his relationship with the Nation of Islam. Unable to look past Muhammad's deception, Malcolm decided to found his own religious organization, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. It was also during this time that Malcolm X helped to change the terms used to refer to African Americans, from Negro and colored to Black and Afro-American. But after he started his new organization, Malcolm went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, Saudi Arabia, called the Hajj, which proved life-altering because for the first time, Malcolm shared his thoughts and beliefs with different cultures and found the response to be overwhelmingly positive. That was when he experienced a second conversion and embraced Sunni Islam, adopting the Muslim name Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. When he returned, Malcolm said he had met blonde-haired, blue-eyed men I could call my brothers. He returned to the United States with a new outlook on integration and a hope for the future. This time when Malcolm spoke, instead of just preaching to African Americans with hate and vitriol towards whites, he had a message for all races. He preached a new message for Black Americans to move from civil rights to human rights. Malcolm's new message of forgiveness and unity began to endear him to the more moderate Black and white Christian leaders, including the Reverend Billy Graham. While Muhammad and his new disciple Louis Farrakhan preached death to whites and Jews, Malcolm rejected their teachings, appearing more Christian in his platform than some radical Muslim. His messages were powerful, and they were reaching out to a much wider and more receptive audience, where he embraced whites, Christians, and Jews as all being the children of God and all being the descendants of Abraham, which rapidly marginalized him from Elijah Muhammad, Louis Farrakhan, and the Nation of Islam. After Malcolm resigned his position within the Nation of Islam and renounced Elijah Muhammad, relations between the two had become increasingly volatile. FBI informants working undercover within the Nation of Islam warned officials that Malcolm had been marked for assassination. One undercover officer had been ordered to help plant a bomb in Malcolm's car. Due to the repeated attempts on his life, Malcolm rarely traveled anywhere without bodyguards, and for good reason. On February 14, 1965, the home where Malcolm, Betty, and their 4 daughters lived in East Elmhurst, New York, was firebombed. Luckily, the family escaped serious physical injury. Elijah Muhammad, Farrakhan, and their devoted followers were successful a week later, on February 21, 1965. While speaking to an audience in the Manhattan's Audubon Ballroom, 3 gunmen rushed Malcolm on stage and shot him 15 times at close range. The 39-year-old Malcolm X was pronounced dead on arrival at New York's Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. His death hallmarked a major shift in the relationship between the black Muslims of the Nation of Islam and black Christians, who, while still dealing with civil rights issues and prejudice in many parts of the country, saw the value of Malcolm's message. 1,500 people attended Malcolm's funeral in Harlem on February 27, 1965, at the Faith Temple Church of God in Christ, which is now called the Child's Memorial Temple Church of God in Christ. After the ceremony, friends took the shovels away from the waiting gravediggers, and they buried Malcolm themselves. Later that year, his wife Betty gave birth to their twin daughters, as she was pregnant at the time of his death, adding to the 4 they already had, who had all witnessed the murder of their father. During the trial, one of the suspects, Talmadge Hayer, also called Thomas Hagen, later known as Mujahideen Abdul Halim, confessed to the murder, but claimed the other 2 defendants, Norman 3X Butler, also known as Muhammad Aziz, and Thomas 15X Johnson, also known as Khalil Islam, were not involved in the murder. Despite his testimony, all 3 men were convicted of the murder. Doubts over the guilt of Aziz and Islam persisted, and in 2021, both men were finally exonerated. After Malcolm's death, Betty raised her children and later earned a Ph.D. in 1975 in Education Administration from the University of Massachusetts. Some of Malcolm's quotes are noteworthy, such as, "Ignorance of each other is what has made unity impossible in the past. Therefore, we need enlightenment. We need more light about each other. Light creates understanding. Understanding creates love. Love creates patience. And patience creates unity. Once we have more knowledge or light about each other, we will stop condemning each other, and a united front will be brought about." Malcolm was also noted as saying, "For the Muslims, I am too worldly. For the other groups, I'm too religious. For militants, I'm too moderate. For moderates, I'm too militant. I feel like I'm on a tightrope." Malcolm X's life was one of transitions, from impoverished child to young criminal to radical Muslim to moderate humanitarian-minded preacher, wanting peace and brotherhood for all people. That is perhaps his greatest legacy. Malcolm X is buried at the Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. And in my opinion, your humble narrator, Malcolm X should be remembered as a man who changed and wanted to do good for his people. And he walked away from the violent radical positions he had long held, and that was what eventually saw him killed. Rest in peace, Malcolm. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.